Hello everyone. In the previous video lecture, we have been primarily dealing with the 10 forms of Rupakas. In this lecture, we are going to focus on Uparūpakas. Bharata, in his Natyashastra, was primarily concerned with 10 Rupakas. In other words, Bharata was focusing only on the forms and styles that were then dominant in the art tradition of his time, especially those that had the potential to exhibit the 4 modes of Abhinayas. So Bharata completely avoided minor forms of the drama or Uparūpakas from the ambit of his discussion. But as the time went by, there emerged newer forms of Natya which included one or a few forms of Abhinayas in their representations, instead of employing all the devices and Abhinayas that Bharata insisted on in the drama. These are called Uparūpakas or minor dramatic representations. Although they are called Uparūpakas or the subordinate forms of dramatic representations, they later became extremely influential, popular, and they became literally part of the mainstream. And they often functioned as the substratum of many of the classical art forms we are familiar with now. Dr. Raghavan, in his article Uparūpakas and Nritya Prabandhas, opines that the Uparūpaka is the link or common ground where the classic met the popular and the sophisticated took up the folk form. He continues to say that the name Uparūpaka signifies an effort to codify these lesser and popular forms and assign them a place in the framework of the theory. The primary factor that distinguishes the Rupakas from the Uparūpakas is that while the Rupakas present a full rasa with other minor rasas as accessories or subordinate aesthetic emotions, the Uparūpaka could only present a bhava or bhavas. So a Rupaka was also called Vakyarthabhinaya and the Uparūpaka was referred to as Padarthabhinaya. Dr. Raghavan's observation is handy in this context. He observes that in the Rupaka, a full story was presented through all the dramatic requirements and resources fully employed. But in the Uparūpaka, only a fragment was depicted. And even when a full theme was handled, all the complements of the stage were not present. The Uparūpaka lacked one or other or more of the 4 Abhinayas. We have seen that Bharata says practically nothing about Uparūpakas. Now, how early do we hear about these subordinate forms of dramatic representations? It's an important question. The earliest reference to the Uparūpaka is found in the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana, where we hear of men and women of taste witnessing and taking part in Uparūpakas like Hallishaka, Natyarasaka and Prekshanaka. These Uparūpakas were later mentioned by other theoreticians. Bhamaha and Dandin also mention some Uparūpakas or the subordinate dramatic forms that are to be seen. It is important to note that they do not use the term Uparūpaka in their works. These Uparūpakas that they mention include Dvipadi, Samya, Rasaka and Skanda. Bhamaha does not elaborate on these forms, primarily because the poetry that is to be read is his primary concern. So, he completely avoided the dramatic representations from the gamut of his deliberation in Kavyalankara. The great Mimamsa scholar Kumarila in his Tandravartika also speaks about the minor dramatic representations like Rasaka and Dvipadi. Kalidasa in his Harivamsha refers to the dramatic representation called Challikya that has to be learned by the heroine Malavika. Kohala, who Abhinavagupta in his commentary on Bharata's Natyashastra mentions, is considered the first theoretician to talk about the dramatic forms outside the ambit of the Dasharupaka. However, as per the available historical evidence, Abhinavagupta's Abhinava Bharati can be considered the first literary work to talk about the idea of Uparūpakas in detail. The Uparūpakas mentioned by Abhinavagupta in his Abhinava Bharati include Trodaka, Dombika, Prasthana, Shilpaka, Phanaga, Phaniga, Ragakavya, Prerana, Ramakrida, Rasaka and Hallishaka. Among the authors of the later period, Bhoja, Sharadatanaya and Vishwanatha dealt at great length with Uparūpakas. Bhoja in his Sringara Prakasha discusses 12 types of Uparūpakas. Sharadatanaya in his famous Bhava Prakasha describes or talks about 21 forms of Uparūpakas and also provides a gist of several definitions as given by the previous authorities. And Vishwanatha in his Sahitya Darpana discusses in detail 18 types of Uparūpakas with proper examples. Here we need to note that we may see the same Uparūpaka defined differently by different theoreticians. It could be because these Uparūpakas underwent some changes during the course of time, or the same Uparūpaka was practiced differently in different geographical locations. I must also say that many of the examples of these Uparūpakas mentioned by theoreticians are not extant now, and the identity of many of these forms itself is quite obscure these days. In this lecture, we will be seeing the Uparūpakas mentioned by Vishwanatha in his Sahitya Darpana. And these Uparūpakas mentioned by Vishwanatha in his Sahitya Darpana are 18 in number, and they include Nadiga, Trodaka, Goshti, Natyarasaka, Prasthanaga, Ullapya, Kavya, Premkhana, Rasaka, Samlapaka, Srigadida, Shilpaka, Vilasiga, Durmalliga, Hallishaga, Phaniga and Pragarika. The first Uparūpaka that we are going to examine is Natika. Natika is a subdivision of Nataka. It's a small play that deals with a small story in 4 ankas. The hero of the Natika will always be noble and courageous, and he will be well known to the readers. The heroine of the Natika will be a beautiful woman who has newly fallen in love. She will invariably belong to a noble family. It is mostly composed in Kaishiki Vritti. It should be based on an incident relating to music or affairs of the harem, and it contains an abundance of female characters. It will involve many dances, songs and recitations. Love's enjoyment is its chief feature. In Natika, all the sandhis other than the Vimarsha sandhi will be used. Kalidasa's Malavigagni Mitra and Sriharsha's Ratnavali are considered the examples of Natika. Trodaka will have either 5 or 7 or 9 ankas, and it can have as its characters either human beings or gods. There will be a Vidushaka or a jester in every anka. Sringara will be the dominant rasa of a Trodaka. According to Vishwanatha, a Trodaka has Sringara as its dominant rasa primarily because of the presence of the Vidushaka. Now a question may arise: how can a Vidushaka who indulges in activities related to the Hasya rasa can invoke Sringara rasa? Vishwanatha says that by way of helping the hero in his activities that can induce Sringara rasa, the jester or Vidushaka invokes Sringara rasa in the Trodaka. Kalidasa's Vikramoorveshya is an example of a Trodaka that has 5 ankas. Next one is Goshti. In a Goshti, there will be 9 to 10 unsophisticated male characters and 5 to 6 female characters. The Goshti will be bereft of noble speech and is composed usually in Kaishiki Vritti. It has only 3 sandhis, namely Mukha, Pratimukha and Nirvahana. It has only 1 anka and the dominant rasa will be Sringara. Sattaka is a play that is composed completely in Prakrit language. According to Sahitya Darpana, the Sattaka is composed in Prakrit language from the beginning to the end, unlike Sanskrit plays in which only some characters speak Prakrit language. It has Adbhuta rasa or the aesthetic emotion of wonder as its dominant rasa. It will be bereft of Praveshaka and Vishkambhaka. All the Ankas are named Javaniga. It is somewhat similar to Natika. Rajasekhara's Karpura Manjari, written in Maharashtri Prakrit, is an example of Sattaka. Usually the Sattaka is named after the heroine. Rajasekhara's Karpura Manjari deserves a special mention in this context. We know that Kavya is usually composed in 3 languages, namely Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramsha. But of all these 3 languages, it was Sanskrit that was primarily used as the primary language of the poetic composition or poetic production. Prakrit and Apabhramsha were used for the imitative purposes to portray different kinds of characters. In other words, while the whole Kavya was mainly composed in Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramsha were used only by a few characters. Rajasekhara's Karpura Manjari is considered one of the few literary texts composed solely in Prakrit. This has to be composed in 1 anga. Hasya, or the aesthetic emotion of the comic, mixed with Shringara rasa, or the aesthetic emotion of the erotic, is the dominant rasa of this Uparūpaka. A sycophant will be the secondary hero of a Natya Rasaka. Vasaka Sajja, or a woman who is ready to receive her husband, is the heroine of Natya Rasaka. This requires only 2 sandhis, namely Mukha and Nirvahana, although some argue that all the sandhis other than Pratimukha Sandhi can be used in this form. The hero of the Prasthanaga will be a dasa or a servant, and the secondary hero would be a character belonging to the inferior category. The heroine would always be a servant like the hero. It has got only 2 ankas which are divided into 4 scenes. It mainly uses delicate movements such as the gait of an elephant with occasional vigorous passages. It involves journeying abroad. The exit after each scene is named Apasara. The performance enlivens itself towards the end through the introduction of the heroic sentiment or Veera Rasa on the triumphant return of the hero and the description of his exploits. It also involves the Vipralambha Shringara or the love in separation. The Prasthanaka is often composed in Kaishiki Vritti. It has 2 acts divided into 4 scenes. It mainly uses delicate movements with occasional, strong, vigorous passage such as the gait of an elephant, and the gait of an elephant stands for the idea of journeying abroad. The Shringara Tilaka of Kalidasa is an excellent example of Prasthanaka. Hasya, Shringara and Karuna are the 3 dominant emotions of Ullapya. It usually involves battle, fight, wailing and bloodshed. There will be 4 heroines in Ullapya. Kavya in the category of Uparūpakas should not be confused with the type of poetry we came across in Alankara Shastra. The Kavya here refers to a whole story composed in songs to be danced. Raghava Vijaya and the Marija Vatha are the 2 examples of Kavya that Abhinava Gupta cites in his Abhinava Bharati. If the whole poem is in 1 raga, it is just the Kavya. According to Bhoja, if it is in a variety of ragas, it is called Chitra Kavyas. As an example of what Bhoja calls Chitra Kavya, Abhinava Gupta quotes the poet Kohala's words describing the story of Tripura Dahana. Any vrittis other than Arabhati can be used to compose the Kavya. This has only 1 Anka and has 3 Sandhis, namely Mukha, Pratimukha and Nirvahana. Hasya will be the dominant rasa or aesthetic emotion of the Uparūpaka. In Kavya, both the Nayaka and the Nayiga belong to the noble category. Premkhana has only 2 Sandhis, namely Mukha, Pratimukha and Nirvahana. It requires only 1 Anka and the hero of Premkhana will always be an inferior person. The Uparūpaka involves fighting and conflict and can make use of all the vrittis. Rasaka, which has only 1 Anka, has only two sandhis, namely Mukha and Nirvahana. It will have 5 characters and it is usually composed in Bharati and Kaishigi vrittis. It does not need a Sutradhara or a stage manager. It has a lazy hero and a famous heroine. As the story develops, it attains nobility. According to Abhinavagupta, there are 3 kinds of rasakas, namely Tala Rasaka, Danda Rasaka and Mandala Rasaka. Tala Rasaka, as the name suggests, is a dance done to the accompaniment of the hands marking the time. In Danda Rasaka, the performers dance to the rhythmic beat of sticks that they carry in their hands. The Mandala Rasaka is a circular group dance in which both men and women participate. A Samlapaka has 3 or 4 ankas. A Samlapaka can have all the rasas other than Shringara and Karuna. A Samlapaka will involve a treacherous battle, fearsome incidents, an attack on cities, etc. Kaishigi and Bharati vrittis cannot be employed here. Shilpaka and Vilasika. A Shilpaka has 4 ankas and all the 4 vrittis can be used in the composition of Shilpaka. The hero of a Shilpaka will be a Brahmin. The secondary hero will be an inferior character. Vilasika is a single act drama that includes characters like Vidushaka or jester, Pidhamarda or impudent person, etc. This form of Rupaka is dominated by Shringara Rasa, and the hero of this form of drama will always be an inferior character. It has got 3 sandhis, namely Mukha, Pradimukha and Nirvahana. It deals with a very small event actually. Durmalliga. This Rupaka has 4 ankas and all the 4 sandhis except for Garbha Sandhi. It needs to be composed in Kaishigi and Bharati. It contains Nagarikas or the city dwellers as its primary characters. The events in the first anka should happen within a span of 3 hours. It focuses on the activities of a libertine. The events in the second anka should be complete in 5 hours. In this anka, the focus will be primarily on the activities of the Vidushaka or the stage manager. The anka 3 will deal with events that happen in a span of 6 hours. This anka will deal with a dancing master who teaches courtesans. The last anka, which portrays events spanning over a period of 10 hours, will portray the activities of the city dweller. Like Halisha, Phana has also 1 anka and has only 2 sandhis, namely Mukha and Nirvahana. Kaishigi and Bharati vrittis are employed to compose this form of drama. It has got 7 ankas, namely Upanyasa, Vinyasa, Vibodha, Sathavasa, Samarpana, Nirvritti and Samharana. It involves animals as the characters and is mostly didactic in nature. It has got a variant form which is called Bhanika, where the subject of the stotra is God Vishnu. Regarding the plot of the Bhanika, it is concerned mostly with the pious Harischarita or the lore of Krishna. Prakaranika is very much similar to Natika. Both the hero and the heroine of Prakaranika will belong to the noble category. Vishwanatha in his Sahitya Darpana opines that it is hard to find examples for Prakaranika. It is clear from this observation that it was not popular during that time. These are the 18 Uparūpakas mentioned by Vishwanatha in his Sahitya Darpana. As I told you before, the intention of the lecture is to introduce you to the major forms of subordinate dramatic representations. You may find definitions of the same Uparūpaka with slight modifications and changes in the works of other literary theoreticians. This is primarily because their form must have been changed as time went by, or there could be regional variations. Whatever the case may be, the definitions of the 18 Uparūpakas I mentioned will give you an overview of these art forms. Soon you will see an appendix where I will quote the actual verses from Sahitya Darpana that describe these 18 forms. I hope you have understood this lesson. Thank you.